let's talk about this year's WWDC. In typical WWDC fashion, we have a ton of announcements. We had some hardware this year, but as usual, a lot of software as well. Now, I won't be going over every single thing they brought up in the keynote because it's a very long list of things. You're gonna have to pour me a few more beers if you want to hear my thoughts on every single thing. In this video, I'll be covering the few things that I think stood out to me, and I'll also be making a separate video specifically on iOS 16 because there are actually a lot of new features coming to iOS 16 that weren't brought up during the keynote, I suppose because there's a very limited runtime and the keynote doesn't want to run on for like 5 hours. So you can check out that video in the corner here if you want to see what's coming to iOS 16 that you probably don't know is coming to iOS 16. For me, the few most major announcements that dropped this year at WWDC are the incredible new M2 chip, the brand new MacBook Air, and honorable mention is iPadOS 16, which got a fairly big update. Let's start with iOS 16. The most radical redesign probably is the lock screen. The new lock screen, you can now have widgets on the lock screen and you have a lot more elements in it that are also customizable and personalizable. Is that a word? You also have a more refined notification delivery system. Actually, if you ask me, the new lock screen on iOS 16 reminds me very much of the watch faces on watchOS, the way you're able to customize many of the individual elements, the typefaces, the complications. It reminds me a lot of this. There's also some, in my opinion, rather overdue updates coming to iMessage. You can now mark a message as unread. You can also now undo a message that you've sent. You can unsend messages, and you can also edit sent messages, so you can edit typos out. Now, you can do that up to 15 minutes after you send the message, after which I assume you will no longer be able to retract the message or edit it. There's also this really mind-blowing feature they showed off during the keynote where you can kind of tap and hold onto something in an image and it would automatically crop it out, and you can drag it onto somewhere else and use that cropped out image. Super neat and cool. I'm sure most people's questions would be, how high is the cropping success rate for that? I imagine it would be scene specific. If your subject and the background is not very contrasted, it blends in very much to the background, or if there's very complicated patterns, or if there's foreground sticking into it, then I imagine it would be a lot harder for the neural engine to work that out. But if you're against a very plain background, then I imagine, yes, it would be a very clean and refined cut. I am curious, however, as to whether or not this feature works for any subject or only specifically for subjects that are recognized in visual lookup, because I imagine this would work very well when the subject is something the AI algorithm can recognize. But this feature is not just limited to your Photos app. This even works in Safari, and it's also available on iPad and Mac. So if you see a subject in a web page in Safari, I assume you could just crop that out and drag that out automatically. And here's something that really piqued my interest. There is personalized spatial audio using the TrueDepth camera on your iPhone. I personally am a huge fan of spatial audio on AirPods. It works so well, and supposedly this improvement makes your listening experience more precise and immersive by creating a personalized spatial audio tuning profile using the front-facing TrueDepth camera on your iPhone. My theory is it has something to do with measuring the distance between your two ears, because different people have different head sizes, therefore you have your AirPods at different distances, and that's something the calculation algorithm wants to take into account. I don't think it would be a night and day difference, this update to spatial audio, because spatial audio is already rather great. I would take this more as a refinement pass. Again, I haven't heard it myself, but this is what I imagine it to be. And hopefully this provides an even better and more consistent spatial audio experience among different users. And then there's watchOS 9, many improvements to the fitness features. But I personally am somebody who wears my Apple Watch to sleep, so I use the sleep tracking feature a lot. I was very glad when they introduced sleep tracking to Apple Watch. I think it was in watchOS 8 just a year ago. And now they've improved that to include sleep stages. I love that it now has sleep stages. I'm somebody who cares about my sleep very much. And recently, I just had to do a whole course of antibiotics, so medication tracking is also something that struck a chord with me. You know how you're not supposed to miss a dose of antibiotics as you're finishing the course, and I have almost missed a few, so medication tracking, great feature to have. And then there was the M2 chip. Now, I know many people saw this coming, but I personally was not expecting Apple to announce the M2 chip this early. So I was actually really shocked when I saw this appear on screen. Now, the reason I was so shocked by M2 is because just a few months ago, Apple just announced the crazily powerful M1 Ultra at the Mac Studio event. So I have not recovered from the shock of that, and now there's already M2. Now, I'm really, really glad that M2 is already here, but I'm still coming to terms that we have just entered a new cycle for Apple Silicon. Now, the M2 chip has 25% more transistors than M1. It has 50% more memory bandwidth than M1, and it now supports up to 24 gigabytes of unified memory. That's an upgrade from 16 gigabytes maximum on the base M1, so quite a step up actually. It's got an 18% increase in multi-core performance compared to M1, and the M1 originally had only 8 GPU cores. The M2 now has 10 GPU cores, and Apple says it's 35% faster compared to M1. It also now has a higher bandwidth media engine, meaning you have more powerful video encoding and decoding for stuff like HEVC and ProRes. For a video creator like me, that is massively good news. Now here's the thing, it might not sound very overwhelming, the specs of the base M2 chip. It is definitely a significant upgrade over M1, but having just heard of things like 18 streams of 8K ProRes for the M1 Ultra not long ago, this doesn't sound that crazily overkill compared to what the M1 Ultra was. But bear in mind, this is the fundamental building block of the new Apple Silicon cycle. It's the base M2 chip. When they start scaling it up to the M2 Pro, the M2 Max, and eventually the M2 Ultra, you can imagine how terrifying it's going to get when the fundamentals are that much better and you keep multiplying that into these more powerful and powerful chips. So yeah, terrifying, I think, is the right word to describe what's about to come for the M2 series of high-end processors. And of course, Apple didn't just announce the chip, they also announced a computer that they're going to debut that new chip in. That's the brand new MacBook Air. Now, this MacBook Air has been completely redesigned since the previous MacBook Air. So instead of a curved outer shell treatment, this one follows more of the design language of the previous 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, more of a flat edge. But from the pictures, it looks so incredibly thin. It's just over a centimeter thick and weighs just 2.7 pounds. 2.7 pounds in grams.
That would be 1,224.7 grams.
Okay, so it weighs just over 1.2 kilograms, which is really, really light for a laptop. And aside from your typical silver and space gray, it's now available in Starlight and Midnight. So two colors we've seen before on the newer iPhones and the Apple Watches. I'm really loving the way the Midnight MacBook Air looks. It also gets MagSafe charging now, just like the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. And in terms of ports, you have two USB Type-C Thunderbolt ports and you have one headphone jack on the other side. And that would appear to be it in terms of physical ports. The display on this new MacBook also has a rather significant upgrade. It's now a 13.6-inch liquid retina display with thinner borders. It's also brighter than the previous generation. This is now 500 nits. And they did also say it supports up to 1 billion colors, which means you now have a 10-bit panel in the MacBook Air. The previous generation was an 8-bit panel. You get an updated 1080p FaceTime camera. And this time round, the speaker is between the keyboard and the display. Traditionally, it was always you have your speaker grills towards the sides of your keyboards. So from what I'm seeing here, there are no speaker grills on this new MacBook. So right around the hinge area of the new MacBook Air, it's concealing a 4-speaker sound system with spatial audio. This new design, because it's using the M2 chip, is also completely fanless. Alongside this, they're also launching this dual USB Type-C adapter, which I'm really loving already. It's 35 watts, and it will be retailing for 239 ringgit here in Malaysia. I love the idea of plugging in one brick and being able to power more than one device off of it. The 13-inch MacBook Pro also gets updated with this brand new M2 chip. From what I'm seeing, there are no redesigns happening to the laptop. It would appear to be the exact same chassis, just they're replacing it with the M2 chip. So it's the same chip as the MacBook Air, except the MacBook Pro has active cooling for more sustained performance. And also, I think this is probably one of the last remaining new MacBooks that still have a touch bar. No mention of the Mac Mini though, so I'm curious what's going on there. And the new macOS is named Ventura. I was wondering what they were going to name it. I think Ventura rolls off the tongue better than Monterey, but it now has a brand new UI called Stage Manager. It looks to be this multitasking interface that's quite useful if you're switching between different apps very frequently. From watching Craig's demo on stage, I think this is one of those features that will be quite difficult to evaluate just by watching someone use it. It's probably something you have to use yourself and experience yourself to really understand. So I'll be reserving my thoughts on Stage Manager until I get my hands on the actual feature itself. Something they did not mention in the keynote is System Preferences on macOS has now been renamed to System Settings in macOS Ventura, and supposedly there is improved navigation, there's now a sidebar, and it's easier to find your settings. During the keynote, they also had a representative from Capcom come on the keynote and say that Resident Evil Village is going to be coming to Mac, along with a few other titles. But for me personally, I don't play Resident Evil, but to have a big title like Resident Evil come out on an Apple keynote and say that they will be developing the app natively for Apple Silicon, I think it's great, because many people think that Macs cannot game, and the reason people don't generally game on a Mac is not because the hardware is not capable of it, it's because not many games were developed for the system. So I hope with this, it kind of sets off this ripple effect to encourage more developers to come on and develop games natively for Apple Silicon. I just hope it doesn't go out of hand and we start seeing RGB Mac Studios. But anyway, here's another feature that I was very excited to hear. You can now hand off FaceTime calls between your devices. Previously, when you receive a FaceTime call, you have the option to pick it up from any of your devices. But once you pick it up, you're kind of locked into that device you picked it up from. You're committed to finishing the call on that device. Now you can hand it off seamlessly between different devices, which is great news. But here's something big. Continuity camera. Basically, the ability to use your iPhone as a webcam for your Mac. And they say it can automatically recognize and use the iPhone camera as a webcam on Mac with no need to even select it. Now, you do have to be on the same Apple ID for your iPhone and the Mac for this to work, but with it, you get center stage, portrait mode, and also studio light when you use continuity camera as a webcam. I think this is a great move because they are not wasting the amazing potential that's sitting in your pocket. Our iPhones have a really good high quality camera that's very convenient because it's always with us, and continuity camera I think really harnesses that power and value adds to the Apple ecosystem further. It's also not limited to just FaceTime, it works with other video conferencing apps as well. There's also a mode called Desk View, which apparently uses the ultra-wide angle camera on your iPhone, so you can see a front-facing you, but also a top-down view of your desk. To use continuity camera and portrait mode, you would need an iPhone XR or later. If you want to use center stage and desk view, it works with iPhones 11 or later. And for studio light, it works for iPhone 12s or later. They did mention during the keynote that they will be working with Belkin to make the stands that fit on top of your Mac. It looks like for iPhone 12s and later, there's a MagSafe option for attaching your phone to it. So continuity camera can work completely wireless, but there is also an option to use a wired connection, which I can only assume is probably more robust compared to the wireless connection. There is also the option to use your iPhone as a microphone for your Mac as well. I think it would be really cool if you're able to use it as a wireless microphone, kind of like a lavalier microphone, except it's the size of a phone. But nonetheless, you can probably get it closer to your sound source and therefore have better quality video conference audio. And finally, there's iPadOS. Now, they did save iPadOS for last in this keynote. Not sure if they're saving the best for last, but in my opinion, iPadOS has received a major overhaul. They've introduced this reference color mode, which essentially lets you use your iPad display as a reference monitor together with your Mac when you're using creative apps for things like color grading or just checking your color. In the fine print, it does specifically say that this feature is for the 12.9-inch iPad Pro with Liquid Retina XDR display, which is referring to the M1 Mini LED iPad Pro because that has the best display out of all the iPads. But previously, I did have this thought that there's this incredible Mini LED display on my iPad Pro, and I can't really harness its power for times when I'm video editing on my Mac. And now, Apple seems to have taken care of that. It does also say it works with Mac computers with Apple Silicon, so I imagine this would be a rather specific use case for when you have a Mac with Apple Silicon and you happen to have the 12.9-inch M1 Mini LED iPad Pro, that you can use that as an external Pro display for your Mac. There's also display scaling, which they said is enabled by the M1 processor. So I imagine at the moment, it only works on the M1 iPad Pros and the M1 iPad Air. But essentially what that allows you to do is fit more content onto your iPad display, which I'm again a huge fan of. The same stage manager that they introduced in macOS Ventura is also coming to iPadOS 16. Now, I think Stage Manager adds a lot more value to iPadOS, because not only do you now have sizable windows, you also now get full external display support up to 6K, and that's with a separate desktop. Previously, if you hooked up your iPad to an external display, it would just be mirroring the 4:3 portion of your iPad display, so you always have black bars on the side of your screens. The exception would be if you're, say, presenting a Keynote deck, then it would have the presenter view on your iPad and the full screen presentation on the external display. But beyond that, you're pretty much locked into mirroring. So now, not only can you have a separate full screen display externally, you can have up to 4 apps on your iPad display and 4 other apps on the external display. So powered by just a single iPad, you can have up to 8 apps running simultaneously in the foreground, I imagine, which is a lot to take in for an iPad. So those have been my personal highlights for what Apple has announced at WWDC 2022. Let me know down in the comments what are the new features or products that you are most excited about. Also, don't forget to check out my other video where I talk about some of the features new in iOS 16 that weren't covered in the keynote. So go ahead and check that out, and maybe I'll see you in that video.